the Weekly Show with David J. Maloney.
This week, David chats with the multi-talented actress Vivian Lamoli.
And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome, everyone, to the Weekly Show. I'm your host, David J. Maloney. On tonight's show, we've got part two of my interview with Steve Hackett. The band Steve might be best remembered for, Genesis, spawned the careers of not only himself, but also Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel, and Mike Rutherford. His guitar style has been copied and built onto by thousands of players, and many still consider him to be one of the all-time greats of rock. So stick around, because we've got former Genesis guitarist Steve Hackett coming back right after the break. Don't go anywhere. When you make an album, does it mean writing songs until you stumble up into a single, or does it mean something else? In other words, are you trying to put something together that's cohesive? I'm not necessarily speaking from a theme standpoint, but a lot of times with prog rock, there is that kind of, sometimes there is an ongoing theme throughout the album. When you approach an album, yes, how do you approach it?
Well, I tend to approach it thematically, because I often think that I've done a track and it seemed perfectly good, and but then I'll start to get other ideas that could have been used in that track. Now, when I worked with Chris Squire, when we were doing Squacket, I noticed that what he tended to do was, if somebody had an idea, and we had a three-man writing team at that time, anyone who had an idea, the song expanded to include that idea. So it would come around again, there'd be a variation, and then there might be a solo or a bit of added detail. The Genesis approach was more thematic. In other words, we would take something and reprise it. The Beatles have given us license to do that, of course. So with Foxtrot, you'll get a recapitulation of theme from the beginning of Supper's Ready. The theme comes back right at the end. So it's that kind of thinking. It's really drawing more from concertos and symphonies and all of that thematic solo sort of stuff. So I do tend to think long form if I can. And I don't really know what makes a hit single. I suspect what makes a hit single is the conditions surrounding the recording, other than the writing. You have to have, for a hit single, a sufficiently young team who have a record company who are pulling out all the stops, who are right behind them. Then you have full license to go and write the kind of stuff that will thrill people of all ages. And in my whole time, 50 years plus in the music business, I've only really been involved with 3 hit singles, and one was with Genesis. It was I Know What I Like. The other one was a solo piece called 151, Cell 151 from Highly Strung. And the other one was when I was working with Steve Howe, and we had GTR, and we had a hit with When the Heart Rules the Mind. So I think those songs were written to order as singles, and that's quite rare for progressively minded musicians. It doesn't happen every day of the week, but when you've got somebody like Clive Davis behind you, as it was when we were doing a GTR, we were aware that we were in a position where if we did something that would be accepted by the media, by MTV at that time, we could perhaps upgrade ourselves from being something that was merely progressive, and we could run with the ball with that. And I think it was a song I was very proud of. We worked together, and I re-recorded it in recent years, not just with Steve Howe, but with Steve Rothery of Marillion, and I think that it came out very well indeed. And I'm often thinking that it was put on a box set, and probably all those people who didn't go out and buy the box set may have missed it on its revisit. So maybe at some point it should be included on something that's a more digestible thing. In other words, yeah, something where you're not forking out all that money for a box set. But I was very proud of it anyway. I thought it had a great sound. It could probably be upgraded still now.
Was there any song in the Genesis discography that surprised you at how well it did?
Well, I was surprised that I Know What I Like did as well as it did, because I used to joke about it being our hit single. I joked about it, I think, to enough DJs that they thought I was being serious. And then, lo and behold, the joke stuck and it became a hit.
Is there a Genesis album that you feel has stood the test of time best?
Well, I suspect that's probably Foxtrot because of the breadth of the writing. I know that one night I was heading into a club and I used to know the guy on the door, and he always had music playing. And I heard something and I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Who's that?" He said, "You're joking, aren't you? That's you guys." And it was a section out of Can Utility, the last song on the first side, as it was, of Foxtrot. And it was a song I'd written and spearheaded, and I didn't recognize it at all. I just wandered in and I heard it in the distance, and I thought, "Oh, that sounds good. They kind of sound symphonic, these guys." Again, mellotron, that thing, orchestra and band. And that was always the idea of two separate schools of thought, the instinctive, untrained musicians working with trained, and the score sheet meets the riff and all of that, improvisation, all of those different things that are kind of contradictory, coming together, fusing together. Because I always loved the term fusion, but that was reserved specifically for jazz rock at a certain point in time. But I always loved the idea of the terminology. And I used to use the word collision for that, different worlds colliding. And I like that, when you get two things together that really shouldn't belong. And perhaps orchestras should never work with bands, and bands should never work with orchestras. But when they do, you get something really wonderful. Incidentally, I heard some stuff recently that Neil Young had done with orchestra and big band, and I thought, yeah, great. Back to the heady days of Man Needs a Maid. Always thought that worked very, very well.
I'm sitting here now trying to think of Rust Never Sleeps with an orchestra. So is there a Genesis song you think that stood the test of time the best?
Well, my favorite Genesis tune of all time is Dancing with the Moonlit Knight, because I think that it goes through so many changes, from a cappella plain song at the beginning through to something that's Elgarian, and then something that one could only describe as fusion, but with a nod to Mozart in places. And I don't think anyone has ever written anything quite like that. And I think it's full testament to Phil Collins' drumming, that he was able to take everyone's ideas and fuse them all together and make it swing, because there are moments where almost every bar changes and there's a change of gear going on the whole time. So it's absolute changes of scene that are going on all the time. And I think it's very difficult to make that sort of thing work. I think a lot of the time, drummers that deal with that sort of stuff tend to make it sound staccato. But then I think because he had the Buddy Rich influence, in other words, a sophisticated swing, he was able to bring the use of accents and syncopation to Genesis, which was, at that time largely based on classical music, and made it work very, very well.
And his drumming and the Genesis drum sound is different from so many others. Was that based on miking, or how was that achieved? Because it's a fuller sound. It's a different sound than I can think of pretty much any other band. No.
Well, I think in the early days he was very frustrated with the drum. Drums hadn't quite learned how to be live. No one was using compression distortion and ambient miking. That was to come later. That was really, a product of the 1980s. But there was something about the drum sound on Genesis Live, that first live album that was originally done as a King Biscuit Flower Hour giveaway. And so we put that out as a stopgap between albums. And when you listen to that back, you can hear some great drumming and I think the beginnings of that modern sound that Phil did so well.
What do you see as the major differences between Phil and Peter as vocalists? I mean, what different skills did each bring to the table? And with you having worked with both?
Well, I think they had remarkably similar voices in terms of both having the equivalent of a brass instrument, a rock voice that blasts microphones. I think that perhaps Pete's approach was more cerebral, and he was more of a storyteller, and certainly in the early days of Genesis, the actor's approach, something of the bard in there as well. With Phil, I think that he had the ability to be every man, and just obviously had the touch at a time when the band needed that, and his own career, of course, took off like a rocket. There were similarities. When Phil took over as a vocalist from Pete, he was covering much of the same material. And as far as audiences were concerned that hadn't seen the band live, they barely noticed the blip because he was also a great mimic. But Pete has a great voice. Pete worked on an album with George and Martin that was a Larry Adler album, and the first track on it is Summertime. And Pete's version of that, I said to him afterwards that I thought that was the definitive version of Gershwin's Summertime. So Pete has great soul with his voice. I think Phil took a poppier direction. I mean, I guess their influence would be fairly close. Phil's with Tamla Motown and Pete's with soul music. So yeah, I think you've got two white guys there, but there's no doubt about where they're looking. They're looking across the pond to earlier models of great singing from the oppressed.
On your first solo album, Voyage of the Acolyte, you brought Phil Collins and Mike Rutherford on board.
Yeah.
What did both of them bring to that album?
I think they brought spontaneity and something that was extraordinary, because I was showing them arrangements at 2 and 3 in the morning because I could only get nighttime sessions in the cheap studio that I'd gotten hold of, and I didn't know whether I was going to come out with a bunch of outtakes or a complete album. But they really gave it something. I mean, even on the first track, it's got fire from the word go, because I was doing it live again with the Hungarian band Jave, and they were taking it at the pace of the original recording, which is very, very fast. So I'm going to do it with my own band shortly when they're off on tour, and I think they gave it a lot of intensity, and they were very quick on the uptake, learning the material, and so I think they gave it a lot. Yes.
Was there any reluctance to bring in your Genesis bandmates to your solo project? I mean, like essentially invite them into your kitchen, so to speak?
No, I'd asked them separately whether they were prepared to do that, because at that point in time, most of us in Genesis, because we were a 4-man team at the time, were shortly to be engaged in solo things or things which were extracurricular outside of Genesis. So and Mike Rutherford was due to work with Anthony Phillips, my predecessor in Genesis, and Phil, of course. Brand X was on the horizon for him. So we were engaged in doing things post Peter Gabriel's tenure with the band, tenure, so that we could all let off a bit of steam. So that was the atmosphere at the time. Nobody really knew whether Genesis was going to be a going concern or not after that, because Phil was getting itchy feet. I felt that with the loss of Peter Gabriel, the band's future was by no means assured. And so at that time, it was the right time to experiment. And so I was able to do something with Acolyte because I had carte blanche to do anything I wanted. And that was a very exciting time. Also very exciting working with my brother, John. It was his first fully professional debut on record, and he was playing wonderfully. So flute was a very big part of that album, and many parts of it were acoustic, but it was our version of being acoustic. And so we were both living back at home at that time with parents, and not getting a lot of sleep, but getting great satisfaction coming back with tapes that we'd be playing the next day and thinking, wow, this is taking shape. It's going somewhere. I'm thrilled with it.
So on your solo records, you've worked with kind of a who's who of American artists, from Richie Havens to Steve Walsh of Kansas. Can you talk about those collaborations a bit? What drew you to those artists?
Well, Richie Havens, I met him, although we'd done some gigs together where he was topping the bill. Over the passing of time, suddenly we were topping the bill, and we were playing London's Earl's Court. And I asked him to dinner. I met him and his keyboard player, Dave LeBolt, and at the end of the evening, he suggested we work together. I didn't want to be too pushy, but I absolutely loved him, adored his voice. We all did in Genesis, and so I we used to see him every time he was in London, and so that was great. Steve Walsh, I met the band Kansas, and I knew that they'd had great success with the album that had Carry On Wayward Son, and I loved his voice. It was absolutely great. So I liked working with those guys. That was great as well.
Did you get to work with Jimmy Page on that Box of Frogs album, Strange Lands? I mean, the image of having both of you in the same room together kind of blows my mind a bit.
Well, we vaguely knew each other, but we weren't in the same room at the same time. But that's a very interesting, Box of Frogs was the reformed Yardbirds, and that was really great.
So you mentioned earlier GTR, which is one of the greatest supergroups of all time, with fellow guitarist Steve Howe. Whose idea was that, and why did the other guy accept?
Well, that's interesting, because I was talking to Brian Lane, who'd managed Yes and was the manager of Asia, and Steve Howe had just left Asia, and because we were near neighbors, I was with Brian Lane, this is the manager, and he said to me, Steve Howe isn't doing anything at this moment in time, and basically we hit on the idea of what would it be like if two guitarists got together and did something. Had there been any instances in the past of two guitarists of some pedigree doing something together? And you'd have to go back to earlier models of the Stones and the Yardbirds for that. And again, this thing that certain bands had spawned great combinations of players. Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck was one of them. So I think we were fans of these people who may have been from a slightly earlier era, and it worked very well for a couple of years. It worked very well indeed, and as I say, Clive Davis was hugely responsible for getting behind that, and we were going to be signed to Geffen. They went off the boil, and it was Clive Davis who saved the day for us and gave us a hit album.
What projects do you have moving forward? I know you said something about working with your band and some touring and stuff. What have you got coming up?
I've got basically this year I've been touring literally everywhere for fulfilling commitments for people who bought tickets 3 years ago. What I've got coming up is I've got a few American and Canadian dates because we didn't get to finish those because of COVID restrictions and what have you. So we're coming back to do a handful of shows, and it'll be Nick DiVigilio who'll be with us, joining us for the first time live. Looking forward to that. Nick also has a history of working with Genesis. So I've recorded with him on a couple of different projects. I'm sure that's going to be great. Looking forward to that tremendously. So that's in the offing. I have a few new things recorded for a new album. I'm going to take a little bit of time to dedicate to that at the beginning of next year. But from here until then, we're basically wall to wall with shows just everywhere.
And lastly, where can our viewers go to follow what's going on with you? Any websites or social media handles that we can throw up here on the screen there?
Absolutely, yes. It's www.hackettsongs.com. Hackett Songs, all one word, lowercase, hackettsongs.com. You get all the information about everything I've done for the past 100 years and beyond.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it's been a real pleasure and somewhat educational. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Hackett.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you. Love your jacket, by the way.
Thank you, sir. That's our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to Steve Hackett for joining us. Stay safe, everyone.